You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. And in this episode, I sat down with Michael Kofman to talk about the war in Ukraine. But before Mike and I get started, I want to tell you about a new-ish show, a new podcast called All Quiet on the Second Front. In this show, Second Front Systems CEO Tyler Sweat cuts through the noise around all things defense tech. I just listened to episode 31 featuring Matthew Zimmerman and John Wargo of Beast Code, and I really enjoyed it. I think you will too, especially if you care about cybersecurity, how the government can buy new and innovative technology, and the promise and peril of that. So definitely check it out at secondfront.com/podcasts or on your podcast app of choice. And I'd like to thank Second Front Systems and All Quiet on the Second Front for supporting this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Mike, great to have you back on the show.
Yeah, great to be back.
So as listeners of the Russia Contingency, our members podcast that you host, know you just came back from Ukraine pretty recently. You were there with our friends Rob Lee, Konrad Muzikat, and Franz Stefan Gatti. And this was your fourth trip?
This is my fourth trip over the course of the last year.
Yeah. Our first one was a year ago that I went on. What's happening now in the war? Let's start in the south.
I think it's fair to say that the offensive in the south, at least the main effort there, has culminated, and it probably culminated sometime around end of September, early October. Ukrainian units are still trying to advance in small groups and widen the salient there south of Avdiivka, but it's a very slow-moving effort and has settled much more into a positional fight where tree lines have donned names and have become almost like major objectives because the fight has circled around several particular tree lines over the course of almost months. Also, you can see a sort of late effort in this year, an attempt to establish a significant lodging in a cross-river operation across the Dnipro and Kherson as well. This is by several Ukrainian Marine brigades. As best I can tell, they've been able to cross the river, establish a bridgehead, and advance a bit into the Russian-held territory, but it's not clear to what extent they can sustain this effort or whether it can make significant progress. Part of the challenge is that it comes late into the year, and it's not really being supported by an offensive that's still really ongoing in Zaporizhia.
What do you think drove this operation? Because it kind of, it's always good to see Ukrainian forces advancing, of course, although they've only advanced a very little, although over a water barrier, which is not nothing. But where do you think is the strategic logic of this late in the year, rather than the overall offensive has culminated, maybe we should husband our forces in preparation for holding up for the winter in the next year? Why launch another offensive operation across the Dnipro River right now?
To show some kind of gains before the year is out, given that the three main axes of advance of the summer and fall offensive weren't particularly successful. And I think to some extent it reflects a 2022 outlook that the West needs to be shown gains in order to sustain support for Ukraine, whereas I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe we're in 2022 anymore. I think folks are clear-eyed that this is going to be a long war, and that tactical gains are not the things that people in the West are necessarily looking for at this stage. I'd hope that operation be successful, but it's certainly gone probably better than people had expected, given the difficulty and the challenge and the risk involved. But to me, its prospects for significantly changing the situation are uncertain.
Well, now they have to hold out there over the winter, which hopefully they can do. But and then maybe that's a lodgment for further offensive next year. But that's the best case scenario.
Yeah, most likely in the best case scenario.
Let's swing back east and north along the front.
I think it's fair to say that the Russian military since October has been trying to seize initiative across the front in a couple of areas. They had, in the far north in Kupiansk, they had made some advances and had largely petered out by end of October, but they had made some gains around Kupiansk, and Kupiansk remains one area of vulnerability. Another one is a bit further south, Svatovo-Kremina, where the fighting has been going on for some time. It's clear Russian forces would like to find a way to get back to Liman. The other main one that I'm sure many folks have heard us discuss is Avdiivka. The Russian military launched a fairly significant offensive at Avdiivka around October 10th. And even though the sort of larger scale mechanized or maneuver version of this operation has now translated into dismounted infantry attacks, they are making some incremental progress in trying to close that salient. I mean, I suspect Ukrainian forces can hold Avdiivka for some time, but there are increasing murmurs whether or not they will eventually have to withdraw from Avdiivka, depending on how the battle goes. That said, closing that salient will most likely only level out the line of contact rather than resulting in any sort of significant breakthrough. So Avdiivka's turned into an attritional fight. The Russian military tried but couldn't put the pieces together for a double envelopment, which is what they were attempting to do. And that fight is ongoing.
Yeah, they're not done trying.
Yeah, absolutely not. And so when it started, there were some superficial comparisons made to Bakhmut. I don't think that's the case. It didn't start the way Bakhmut did as a battle. It's not really geographically situated the way Bakhmut is. And the battle isn't over the city itself. It's more over a salient pocket that's been there for some time with long-established defenses. And it's also not clear that Ukrainian leadership is going to make Avdiivka politically symbolic. I haven't seen that in the way they did with Bakhmut, sort of start a whole, Fortress Avdiivka type public campaign.
And what's happening around Bakhmut right now? You were just there, a week and a half ago, right?
Not in Bakhmut. Bakhmut is now Russian occupied.
Oh, yes. In the suburbs, I guess, or what once were the suburbs.
I've already been to Bakhmut once. I'm not keen on going back.
Yeah.
But I was, there on the outskirts of it where the fighting's been ongoing since May. And I think it's fair to say that Ukrainian operations to press Russian forces still continue, particularly in south of Bakhmut. The Russian military is now trying to seize the initiative there with counterattacks as well. I think that after September, a lot of the effort there is stalled out to some extent. And if we zoom out, two primary reasons why. The first is that the availability of artillery ammunition for Ukraine to prosecute offensive operations has been significantly curtailed, right? We are now back in a period akin to what the winter looked like, if you remember, after the Kherson and Kharkiv offensive of last year. So it's clear across the front that there's a degree of shell hunger, and the artillery ammunition available to support operations, particularly offensive operations, simply isn't there. That can be compensated to some extent with FPV drones, but in defensive operations and then maintaining some degree of denial at relatively short range on the front, but it's not the same thing as actually having the ammunition on hand to support offensives. The second is that Ukrainian forces, while motivated, are exhausted. They've lost a lot of units of action. They've lost a lot of assault-capable troops. And while they continue to try to fight for the initiative, it's very clear that, after offensive operations lasting 5 months, I don't think anybody should be surprised by this. Heading into the winter, the Ukrainian military needs to reconstitute. It needs to regenerate combat effectiveness.
Let's talk about how things have changed tactically on both sides in terms of how each side fights really at the tip of the spear from, let's say, like June to the present this year.
So at that time, that meant that it would be very difficult, or at least costly, to make advances against a well-prepared defense. And that was the purpose of a well-prepared defense, an echelon defense with various means of support. It imposed significant challenges because you needed a lot of enablers and supporting equipment to breach minefields. You need short-range air defense to deal with helicopters. You need to be able to put the pieces together to attain a significant advantage. And even though Ukrainian military had a relative advantage in fires, it wasn't a decisive advantage if you look at the numbers. And its main advantage was qualitative and long-range precision, but it was facing a well-entrenched force and a force that proved to be kind of, I would say, much more effective on the defense than when we had seen it on the offense, right, in previous operations. Now, to the forefront, in addition to those challenges, not in substitution of them, because I've seen narrative to suggest that somehow warfare has significantly changed the last couple of months. In addition to them, have moved to the forefront FPV drones. These are first-person view drones. They're used as strike drones. There's a lot of complexity in how...
So let's talk about these drones. How big are they? How do they fly? What sort of munitions are they carrying?
Sure. So FPV drones have been used since the winter, but they began to proliferate across the front. And you typically see these cycles of adaptation in the war where things that are proven successful very quickly expand and then start being used by both sides. Militaries copy what they see working for the other side. And ironically, though Ukraine pioneered the use of FPV drones, Russia now has more of them and has an advantage in them. And that was clear from talking to troops across the front. That Russia not only has restored an advantage in artillery, it also has an advantage in use of FPV drones.
And a big, like other platforms, a big domestic production advantage that Ukraine doesn't have because it's so reliant on foreign production.
This is an even more interesting, broader conversation, but I would say that what was clear, at least from this visit, is that Ukraine has done very well in adaptation innovation, but these things are being built in small workshops by hand, and they're not being built as complete systems, meaning drones are being built, then units have to go through a dangerous job of attaching munitions to them, of fusing them. And while Ukraine, to me, is sort of a country of thinkers and innovators, and is very good as a civil society for compensating for weaknesses in the state, and it's done a great job in trying to get drones from all these different workshops and labs to the battlefield, it is competing with a different system, a status system, much more of a command system that is not as good at innovating and adapting. But once it selects designs and things that they know works, can scale much faster.
And for those interested, Mike and our other friends discussed this at greater length in the last episode of the Russian contingency, but I derailed us a little bit.
Sure.
Let's go back to FPV drones.
Yeah, so FPV drones are first-person view drones. They're rather light. Their typical range is around 15 kilometers plus. They are often used with a retransmitter drone, a Mavic, with a signal retransmitter attached to the bottom of it that requires a separate flight team that can gauge your range of 20 to 25 kilometers. The signal depends to some extent on topography. You need the higher your altitude is relative to the drone's operation, the better the range you can get out of it. Typically, they are used with strike munitions like rocket-propelled grenades, older munitions, RKG anti-tank grenades. These are, by the way, often cut apart by the people who make these munitions to lighten them. This is dangerous work. You can blow yourself up making an FPV drone very easily. You can blow yourself up fusing it. I won't go into the details. But unlike an artillery shell, when people say, well, you can compensate for artillery shells with FPV drones. Yes, but the folks using artillery shells aren't putting them together by hand at the front, all right? Whereas this in reality is how it's taking place. And there's a shortage of munitions for FPV drones, believe it or not, something that we need to talk about here in the West because that's a problem we should be getting after and we can solve. But so FPV drones are typically used in small groups because right now they're not in a place where they can be used in mass. The signals between them conflict with each other. So people shouldn't get the sense that unlike massed artillery fire, we're in a place in this war where you see massed FPV drone use. But what they have done is they've made it near impossible to move vehicles near the front during daytime. Hence, most assaults take place at dawn or late in the evening, and the last few kilometers to the front, troops often move by foot because, as I heard in different parts of the front, it is near suicide to try to get access to the front line in a vehicle during daytime because you're only going to have a few vehicles, or one or two, and you want to move by small groups at best, and very easily you'll be seen and detected by FPV drone pilots.
What else has been changing tactically? The introduction of FPVs and their broader fielding is one thing.
Well, also is that the scale of action has gotten even smaller. So if it started with reinforced company-sized assaults in June, and then went down to platoon and a half level action in July and August and fighting for individual tree lines, it has now gone down to assault groups, with both sides use groups of somewhere between 14, 16 men maybe, and in combination with vehicles, where vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and tanks suppress a trench line or defending point a position in a tree line. The armored personnel carriers drive all the way right up to the trench and dump assault troops right on top of it very brazenly, and they have to get into it as fast as they can. Why?
The APCs can get to the trench lines?
So, yeah, if the operation's done right, they can. I don't want folks to get the sense that this is only just dismounted infantry attacks. It's not, and it's not been that way. And tanks have played a valuable role, particularly in the defense, but also still in supporting offensive operations, just in a much smaller scale. And the reason why is it's very difficult to concentrate troops. You're not going to clear minefields or have the enablers for a sizable sort of scaled attack. But most importantly, you can't concentrate because of artillery fire. And what we saw was the integration of ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance means, and coordination of fire support in different parts of the battlefield such that when an attack is detected, let's say by the Russian side, it is only a few minutes. We're talking 4, 5, 6 minutes before fire is already coming down.
And I believe you observed this on your last trip, right?
I did very much observe it. And what I saw actually is a big evolution in command and control with Ukrainian forces using apps that integrate drone feeds, put everybody in the same room, allow them to talk to their drone pilots, allow them to do call for fire right off the bat with coordinates. Yes, they still depend on Signal and WhatsApp and other things to send things between each other, but I saw an evolution in how well this is done. And the pervasiveness of sort of surveillance and the ability to see on the battlefield situational awareness. And the fact that the fight's been taking place over the same places for the last 5 months has made it much more of a positional fight, where many artillery pieces are firing basically from static positions because they can cover the same range on the front that they've been able to cover for the last 5 months. They really
the
haven't
front's not moving that much, yeah.
That's right.
What else has changed?
I think what's also really changed is the evolution of electronic warfare. In answer to the evolution of FPV drones, right? So there's a lot of fetishization I've seen of technology in FPV drones, and that they've advanced, although it's still not a technology that's that matured yet, in my point of view. We've seen the development of miniaturized electronic warfare systems, Tranche EW, that essentially jam signals within only 200 meters, but now troops are operating everywhere with their own personalized systems deployed, systems on top of vehicles, and innovation sort of in defense against FPV drones. And even though the drones are kind of in the lead, right, you see the means of trying to defense or counter them, trying to keep pace. And of course, adaptation in tactics and in how both sides sort of approach the fight. On the Russian side, they doctrinally changed because they couldn't sustain the volume of artillery fire. They didn't have the ammo. So they switched much more to precision, Lancet drones, cross and pole, laser guided artillery munitions, and what have you, these types of means. And on the Ukrainian side, you also saw significant adaptation and starting to be able to develop much greater capacity to strike at longer range on the battlefield, and also develop their own electronic warfare systems. So you see that despite the perception that maybe this front is static, in reality, you see a lot of innovation and adaptation on both sides as they seek to counter each other and establish an advantage.
Let's talk about one last change.
One last change I would add, and I don't think we've discussed as much, is the extensive Russian use of FAB 500 kilogram bombs in standoff mode as glide bombs. And they have a lot of them, and they've been using this extensively to strike Ukrainian positions and units. They're not very accurate.
In the rear or at the front, or both?
At the front, but we're talking about something like 40-plus kilometer ranges. And I actually myself got to see how Ukrainian forces are able to have very good track of the Russian aircraft who fly in established routes and launch these glide bombs at standoff range and then pull away. Like I said, they're not very accurate, but they provide significant advantage in standoff firepower.
What's the payload on these things?
500 kilograms, and they've basically adapted bomb glide kits. They're fairly rudimentary, but they are effective, and they're increasingly using them on 1,500 kilogram bombs. And you should see the crater that a 500 kilogram bomb makes. I've seen some of these. A 1,500 kilogram explosive is going to demolish completely entire buildings. And also, it's been clear talking to Ukrainian troops that despite the highly successful use of ATACMS missiles in that attack against 2 Russian helicopter bases, that Russian forces fairly quickly reorganized to use forward rearming and refueling points and disperse their helicopter fleet, so that most helicopters are now out of range, and they're basically moving up to the forward field points to refuel and rearm, and still being used in small numbers, that they are a persistent problem on the front line. Meaning that attack was highly successful, but folks should not be misled into believing that now it's eliminated the K-52 and the Mi-28 and the Russian attack helicopter threat. That's not what I heard from Ukrainian troops.
Taking a break here from my conversation with Mike to tell you a bit more about our supporters for this episode, All Quiet on the Second Front. There's 32 episodes out so far. I think you'll really enjoy it. One of the things that I really enjoy about this show is the personality of the host. Tyler Sweat, who is the CEO of Second Front Systems, hosts the show. He's got buckets of personality. He's a veteran. He's got great stories. He's got war stories. He's got battle scars, including and especially from running a company trying to do work with the Defense Department, which is hard. And he talks really candidly about the challenges in doing that. Let's listen to a few of my favorite clips from the show so far.
Emerging tech is one of those things that people are really interested in, but they have no idea what it is or how to buy it.
You guys are doing stuff at Second Front that was basically illegal when I was at the NSA. Like, let's take DoD data, put it on somebody else's server and bring it to the warfighter, right? Like, that's basically science fiction.
A lot of podcasts these days will talk about how we should do business with the Defense Department and how it's important, which it is. But as I mentioned earlier, it's hard. And what I really like about this show is he talks about how hard it is while not losing sight of the mission.
When you're going to the warfighter saying, I've got this great tool that is going to give you 3D representations of your platform that's going to help you do all these different jobs, they go, bullshit. I've heard this before. I've had this brief. But if you can get that initial win to them, they go, okay, all right, this is actually cool. I'm actually using this, and keep building up on it for years and years and years.
So again, I like this show. Honestly, I do. And I think you should check it out. You can find it at secondfront.com/podcasts or on your podcast app of choice. I'd like to talk about the big picture and where this war is heading into next year. But before I do that, as you mentioned, this is your 4th trip to Ukraine. On every one, you've gone to or very near to the front and learned quite a lot. The United States still does not have battlefield observers, military observers in Ukraine. There's reports of British SOF in country, Special Operations Forces, but I don't think Special Operations Forces are necessarily the best battlefield observers, especially for learning for the broader force. What do you think the United States is missing out on, both for its own learning, for its own purposes, but also actually understanding how Ukraine is fighting by not having military observers in country? And what larger strategic costs do you think that this actually imposes on the West's ability to support Ukraine?
I think it's missing out on a great deal. And it's led to an unworkable theory of our role in this war, that we are involved in material support sustainment, provision of intelligence, joint planning, gaming, everything, but that we are not going to do the critical task of understanding the operating environment, figuring out how our own partners and allies actually fight, and what their abilities are, what the nature of their force is, and also drawing the right lessons learned. I was actually surprised on this very trip. I was confronted with this very question by folks in the Ukrainian military who basically asked, why are you not here? Why are Brits here but not you? Why do you not have analysts? Why do you not have observers? Are you not interested in the lessons learned from this war? Are you not interested in concept development and doctrinal development? Of course we are. And the U.S. has...
we say we are.
Yeah, we say we are. And I'm sure the U.S.
Revealed preferences is very explanatory in this regard.
Right. Behavior is a better indicator of preferences and how vested we are in it. And I think one of the biggest mistakes in retrospect, this is at least my view of how history will record it, will not be that we didn't provide, ATACMS at the right point, or we didn't provide F-16 sooner, or this or that. It's the fact that we weren't there. And the offensive revealed it, by the way. The offensive showed in significant and important ways we did not understand the operating environment. We did not understand how Ukrainian forces fight. And we could have done things, I think, differently and better in retrospect. We learned quite a bit from it. But have we changed policy? And by the way, this is not, to be clear, we've discussed it before, this is not a boots-on-the-ground policy where now U.S. uniformed personnel have to be there and we get on a slippery slope of advisors and what have you. That's not what people were proposing. But it is very evident how much we're missing out on. And the truth is, I don't believe we can continue in this war in 2024 the way we've done it 2022 and 2023.
Yeah, and let's be direct about it. The Ukraine's offensive was a missed opportunity. It was, I think, a failure. I think it's fair to say it was the most generous thing to say about it was a missed opportunity. It accomplished some important things and posed costs on the Russians, and you're going to talk about that in a future episode of the Russian Contingency where you do your postmortem of the offensive. And Ukraine has to own some of those failures. But a large part of it is also the U.S. and Britain, from what I've read, and Shashank Joshi has spoken about this, foisted a larger operational concept on Ukraine for this offensive that Ukraine could not actually execute on. Now, Ukraine has to own some of this too. I'm not saying this is all the West's fault. This is, this defeat has 1,000 fathers. But what do you think of that?
I think, ironically, if you look at the offensive, the most successful part of it was the actual fight at the tactical level, where despite not being able to achieve their objectives, even their minimal objectives in offensives, if you look at the overall balance of losses as a fight that was primarily prosecuted in an attritional manner, right? Ukrainian losses are not significantly greater and are assumed to be in parity with Russian losses over the course of this offensive.
Whereas usually the offender takes much
side.
Heavier casualties, the attacker side.
Yeah, that's right. So
it's a silver lining.
The silver lining, the only silver lining that I have, and I'm not a big sort of silver lining merchant, like analytically, but the silver lining that you can say is that at the very least at the tactical level, the offensive was closer to a draw than not on the balance of force and damage inflicted. even though I completely agree with the offensive was not successful. It wasn't successful in achieving its objectives. And the sooner we can all say that and not make alibis that, well, something happened to the Black Sea Fleet, let's shop that as a success or something else, the sooner we can learn from it, revise the vision, the strategy, and approach, as we discussed in the past podcast for 2024, 2025, and begin making the right changes rather than trying to sell to each other and rationalize.
I commented on this on Twitter. I think you saw it. There's just too many people out there observing the war, well-meaning, I'm sure, but are too willing to move the goalpost to define anything that Ukraine is doing as a success, which is just not helping anybody. First and foremost, it's not helping Ukraine.
Yeah, and I didn't get that sense from Zaluzhnyi's interview in his article either. That he's at a place where he's interested in people telling him that this is still a great news story.
Let's talk about big picture, where the war is heading, where we stand now.
So I've debated this topic a bit with myself. So I'll put out at least what are certainly not fully, I would say, coherent or congealed views, but. First, I don't think we're quite in a period of positional warfare yet for a couple of reasons. One, both sides are not entrenched. I actually think Ukraine very much needs to entrench. It needs to copy the advantages that, as demonstrated by Russian prepared defense, to better set itself up for defense. Because here is the truth, and people need to look at it very clear-eyed. Russia will be materially advantaged in 2024 in artillery ammunition, in production of drones, and likely long-range drones and cruise missiles too.
And it should be said that it didn't have to be this way, especially Europe had gotten its act together sooner.
Absolutely. And I'll say something else. I think Russia's gotten more artillery ammunition from North Korea in the last 2 months than Ukraine probably got from Europe. The reality is that Russia is materially advantaged not just because of the ammunition it's getting from other countries.
You mean than Ukraine got from Europe in the last 2 months or ever?
That's a good question. I would bet probably ever. I would say probably ever.
Well, if that's true or even close to true, that's quite a damning indictment of Europe's seriousness on defense, and particularly Europe's leading powers.
I don't want to get into it because I'm sure folks are tired of hearing me talk about artillery ammunition and rag on European countries. It's not the case.
We did that plenty in the last couple of episodes.
It's not the case of all of them, and I heard some complaints from European colleagues that basically said, not all of us, what about Bulgaria, Romania, Czech Republic, although the U.S. is probably funding through contracts quite a fair bit of that production. But to get back to the topic, so look, here's the reality. Russia's going to be materially advantaged. The good news is that they're going to try to go on the offensive, and as Gerasimov showed, he's going to try to do it prematurely and when the forces aren't ready.
He loves doing that. That's like his thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the thing. There's a thesis that Russia's advantaged in a positional war. I don't actually agree. It would be if Russian objectives were defensive only in nature, but they're not. Okay, if they were, then Russia wouldn't be conducting offensives. They need to take the Donbass, and they're showing that they're not able to put the pieces together for significant breakthrough and gains. And
what percentage, just to give people who don't know the geography of Ukraine as well as you do, what percentage of the Donbass roughly does Russia hold right now?
Oh, let me try to think at this point. They hold pretty much all of Luhansk, and I got to look, but maybe half or so of Donetsk. But their problem is that their gains in recent offensives, let's say over the course of this past year, can be measured in a few kilometers. For example, in Kupiansk, their gains over the course of October were probably 3.5 kilometers, Ryan. Okay? So just so folks understand, when I say kilometers, I mean single-digit kilometer figures.
Russia's gains.
Yes, Russia's gains. In Avdiivka, in the first offensive that they did in October, their gains could probably be measured in meters rather than kilometers more fairly. So just to understand that, on the one hand, it may seem, they only have to take the other half. Yeah, all Gerasimov had to do from April of 2022 was to take the rest of the Donbass that they don't control. And actually spent a fair amount of time after getting up to Bakhmut, losing the part of Kharkiv that was essential to Russian offensive operations. And so far have not shown significant ability to take, to gain more territory in the Donbass. So first, I think the challenge Russians have is actually positional warfare would favor them significantly if they simply stuck to defense, but their political aims necessitate offensive operations. This is problem one for them. The main issue is that no matter what the war is, how you characterize it, positional, attritional, more maneuverous, and it's a false dichotomy, but just to use these characterizations, the war materially advantages Russia next year. But this is not a decisive advantage, or at least it doesn't look that way. To me, I don't see a durable or stable stalemate on the ground. I also don't see either side committed to a positional war yet, although we're going to see probably a prolonged attritional phase again. I don't see Russia committing to a positional war. Clearly, if you look at the attack at Avdiivka, they were attempting a scaled-up operation engaging in maneuver warfare. So they are not committed to a positional war either. Meaning, I don't like the World War I, 1916 analogy.
Let's unpack stalemate, the word and what it means. And it's. I didn't have time to look into the etymology of this before we started recording, although I meant to. But I think that sometimes the trouble is this is one of many words to do with war and warfare that are political as much as they are value neutral words, right? I think what people worry about is when they use the word stalemate, is that a stalemate is a slippery rhetorical slope into frozen conflict, or a conflict that can't be resolved and therefore must be negotiated. Whereas if you think about it a little more critically, a stalemate doesn't imply permanence. One of the most famous, how many times have you heard the term breaking a stalemate in your life? Many times. So I think people are maybe too afraid of using this word because they might, part of them might worry that it means they're writing off the value of the conflict or the possibility that Ukraine can win, when I don't think that's what that word necessarily implies.
No, what's important to understand is the difference between, let's say, both sides being stalemated in this current phase of the war to the assumption that the war is a stalemate and that's how it's going to continue.
Correct.
And all the evidence, just looking beyond the mere question of territorial gains, all the evidence shows that the war principally is not stalemated.
We didn't talk about this beforehand, but what's your criteria for making that judgment?
First, I see a notional parity between the two sides, right? But I don't see a clear-cut parity where I am able to walk away saying that one side isn't advantaged over the course of the next year. Unfortunately, Russia's advantaged in most material categories. This is the first problem. And so when folks say stalemate, what they don't understand is that I think that depending on how the war turns out and the decisions the West makes, the war will not be stalemated, and Russian advantage in 2024 will turn into more significant Russian advantage in 2025.
These are compounding advantages, potentially.
That's right. This is the first problem with the notion of a stalemate, because those folks want to see kind of a frozen conflict, imagine that that's it.
So you're coming at it from another side, whereas most people don't want to say stalemate because they worry it makes Ukraine's case for continuing the war look bad. You're saying actually you're missing Russia's advantages by saying it's a stalemate.
Yes, you are. You are very much missing Russian advantages, and you're also missing the fact that if the West just assumes that it's a stalemate and can reduce its commitment to Ukraine, Russian advantages will compound because Russia doesn't accept the stalemate.
Well, it could still be a stalemate now because Russia has not fielded those advantages yet.
Yes, but but we're looking at this at a particular phase of the war.
And we always are, but yeah.
And we've been in phases of this war before that feature primarily positional attritional warfare, right? Going back to last winter, maybe going back to August of last year. And this is a phase that's likely going to be more of a prolonged phase, but we're going to see most likely more Russian offensives. Okay, another part is we're missing the strategic picture, right? Which is the Russian increased ability to engage in critical infrastructure attacks. They've saved up a lot of drones and munitions to try to go after Ukraine's power grid again.
You think it'll be worse this winter than it was last winter?
Yes, I do. And I think even though we've done quite a bit to invest in Ukrainian air and missile defense, but you can only defend a few of the cities and some critical infrastructure. Ukraine's a large country, and it's impossible to defend all of it from these types of attacks. Simultaneously, Ukraine has made significant advancements and investments in long-range strike means too. And you can see them increasingly using them to greater effect. So even though, look, at the front line, at that tactical level, we might see the two sides relatively stalemated in the gains they're able to make, we have to step away from that and to look at the broader picture of what the war is going to look like between Russia and Ukraine. And it's going to be quite dynamic. I think stalemate conjures the notion that not much is going to happen. I think that's kind of the way people interpret it, whereas actually quite the opposite is true, the way I see this war developing.
Let's talk about manpower. Why hasn't Ukraine mobilized more of its young men, particularly? I was looking at figures recently, and I was surprised that there wasn't more. Is it because the training pipeline is just not sorted? It wouldn't make much of a difference anyway, or what is it?
Thorny subject, I think, in Ukraine. That's another politically charged topic. So I think part of the answer could be that. Part of the answer could be political, the difficulty of mobilizing so many people and the political implications of particularly mobilizing younger people. Some part of the challenge has also been corruption. And it's been very clear on what's been happening in the Ukrainian mobilization offices over the last year and a half. And responses to it, the firing of the heads of all 24 mobilization offices, it certainly was demonstrative, but I don't know what the net effect on the mobilization system was from that decision.
Part of it, though, does seem to be political will. It's fine if you don't understand it either, but I'd love to understand better why Zelensky is cautious about it. Or if it is Zelensky's decision, I don't know.
Well, and it could also be that they don't believe that they would significantly benefit from it anyway, but I did get a sense in Ukraine, if there was a frustration on the front line of folks fighting, it wasn't a lack of motivation. It was the perception that this is going to be a long war and that society doesn't look and feel mobilized the way it should be to prosecute it. Whether you're talking about mobilization of actual personnel to replace losses, whether you're talking about force generation, creating additional units, or you're talking about mobilization writ large. And I know that might be the perspective of just any person on the front line, but it does to some extent. It is a criticism I heard that.
What about the Russian side in terms of manpower? What's going on there?
The manpower on the Russian side, the situation is not great for the Russian military, but they've been able, through their recruitment campaign, I think, to significantly replace their losses. Their issues are more structural, which is they're probably holding off on another partial mobilization until the March presidential election, which I'm putting in air quotes that people can't see. But the reason for that is they need to rotate, a percentage of the troops they currently have in theater in the fight. They mobilize 300,000 personnel. They're able to replace losses. They're able to regenerate some additional combat power. But if they really want to go on the offensive, they need to be able to do two things. Form more units in significant numbers. And second, rotate the forces they have. And to rotate them, they need to rotate them with somebody else that they've actually recruited, conscripted, mobilized. And so I think they're going to have to address that structural problem under March. I was wrong because I thought they would get to a point where they'd have to do a partial mobilization this fall. But that was based on two assumptions that were incorrect. The first one was the extent to which they would be successful in national recruitment. I don't think any of their official figures are remotely close to reality, but they have been able to recruit some significant
more success than you expected.
Yeah. And the second is the extent to which they would suffer losses in defense against Ukraine's offensive in the summer or fall. Basically, to put it this way, the likely casualties you're going to suffer. But my general sense of it is that the Russian military is in a place where they're able to sustain the force, but only if they wanted to fight a defensive war. If they want to have more offensive like Avdiivka, where they essentially throw away several brigades in the course of a couple of weeks, Ryan, that's
so it's more of a matter of when, not if, they'll do another partial mobilization in your judgment?
I mean, I think so.
What's the best you think Ukraine can hope to accomplish in 2024, realistically?
I think if Ukraine uses 2024 wisely, and we do too in the West, 2024 becomes a build year for force reconstitution, entrenching and freeing up a significant percentage of the force, fixing a lot of issues with training, fixing a lot of issues that we've seen, so drawing the right lessons from what happened in the offensive of 2023, building up stockpiles, investment in localized production, consolidation of Ukrainian equipment, onlining of sort of parts, maintenance, what have you, sorting the force, rationalizing a lot of things, and putting the force in a position that is able to gain significant military advantage, maybe end of the year in 2025. I don't exclude the prospect for another offensive, but I find it unlikely that we can resource one. I am very wary of the tension in this vision with kind of the perception in Ukraine that they need to fight for the initiative and retain the initiative, because if they let go of it, and if Russia's able to dictate operations next year, then they will reconstitute more quickly and put Ukraine in a very precarious position. I think trade-offs have to be made. That's the reality. Like this, strategy can't be everything. Strategy is about choices. So
we've talked about this on the show before. With defending everywhere all at once, attacking everywhere all at once, doesn't seem to have worked out very well for Ukraine in the grand scope.
Right, and fighting for the initiative is not a strategy.
Yeah,
that's not. That's a good way to use up a lot of resources in pursuit of little in the way of gains. And what the last year has shown is actually that even in the course of this offensive, it's pretty difficult to suppress Russian regeneration potential in this way. given seeing their attack at Avdiivka. Actually, most likely, the Russian military will continue attacking before they're ready. And it would be easier to break their offensive potential defensively, regenerate, and then come back at it, right, with restored capacity, and also having benefited from a lot of the programs that are currently being run in the West to provide Ukraine additional qualitative and quantitative advantages.
Thanks, Mike. Great place to end it. Really meaty episode that we had here. Everyone, don't forget to check out our membership program at warontherocks.com/membership, where you can listen to the Russia contingency amongst other awesome members-only features and content. Stay safe and stay healthy.